Everyday Samurai, Episode 39. Greetings, friends, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, in service to your liberty and the security of a free state. You know, if you're someone looking at the hostility in contemporary political discourse, you'll notice that, at essence, the tug of war is over who gets to wield decision-making authority in the name of government. Yet this too leads to a further conundrum because there are differing levels of government. The United States, under the federal Constitution, is a system of dual sovereignty, meaning the several states and the general government share authorities to check the decision-making authority of any one jurisdiction. Taking from an article from the Cato Institute on the subject, quote, "Federalism goes beyond states' rights and powers. Its essence is dual sovereignty, shared authority between federal and state governments with each sovereign checking the other to shield individuals from concentrations of power. Federalism is first and foremost a device to safeguard personal freedom." Close quote. This structure denies a monopoly to any one governmental body, in theory at least, within the federal system, meaning the several states act as a check on the power of the general government, and likewise, the general government limits the actions of state governments through the enumerated authorities delegated to it by the Constitution. Robert Levy of the Cato Institute describes this as an ingenious system, yet history has shown that the states have been incapable of halting the growth of the federal leviathan. Contrary to the advice of Thomas Jefferson in the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, the general government has broken loose from the chains of the Constitution that were supposed to bind it down from mischief. In short, the federal system has failed. The question then becomes, why? James Madison, the chief author and sometimes known as the father of the Constitution, wrote in Federalist Paper No. 51, quote, "A dependence on the people is, no doubt, the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. We see it particularly displayed in all the subordinate distributions of power, where the constant aim is to divide and arrange the several offices in such a manner as that each may be a check on the other, that the private interest of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights. These inventions of prudence cannot be less requisite in the distribution of the supreme powers of the state." Close quote. Madison was speaking directly of the compound system of government unique to the design of American federalism, yet also stated that these principles apply to all human affairs. We see that a division and arrangement of the several offices and departments of government is required to properly distribute the supreme powers of a state. Yet what about when even this fails? Here again, it is time to get back to the basics. Madison states that the primary control on government is to make them dependent upon the people. We see this manifesting in the Constitution as a reliance on those necessary, meaning indispensable institutions known as the militia of the several states, in order for the general government to execute the laws, repel invasions, and suppress insurrections. This is an important point that cannot be emphasized enough. The people, as the militia of the several states, are the chief enforcement arm of the general government, according to constitutional design. This structure completes the circuit of self-government by having the people themselves execute the laws, and for this reason, the Congress was responsible for arming, organizing, and disciplining these necessary civic institutions. In other words, the general government was tasked with encouraging every able-bodied citizen to train in the martial arts, to provision themselves with weaponry, and to ensure that local communities were prepared to deal with security issues. Yet what happens when Congress is derelict of these duties? What do people in a free society do when their representatives fail to perform the tasks delegated to them? And further, what should a free people do when those trusted agents act against the interests of those they were entrusted to represent? Those holding public office are supposed to be the servants of their constituents, yet have begun acting like the masters, with unfortunately far too many people hypnotized into believing this is the natural state of affairs. In this case, what needs to be done? Obviously, the first task is to awaken people from the delusion that the status quo is acceptable, or that what passes for political activity today in any way conforms with the Constitution or the principles of liberty for which the federal republic was formed. Awakening the consciousness that peace and prosperity are the universal gifts of liberty is what Everyday Samurai is all about. For joining us in this awakening, I thank you. and ask that you subscribe so that you never miss an episode, and always share the show with a friend to help grow the community of enlightened warriors willing to apply their martial skills to protect private property and individual dignity. The first stage of transformation is always building awareness. More specifically to our purposes, is an awareness of successful political economic models. Now, models are essential to human beings making sense of how the world works, and they are useful in many aspects of life. Investors, for instance, use market models to determine profitable stock purchases. Psychologists use models to diagnose behavioral and cognitive abnormalities so as to better treat conditions. Metaphysicians use models to describe mental maps of reality. And every success or self-development coach will advise that following the model of someone already exhibiting the qualities, attributes, or behaviors you want is the quickest way to achieve your goals. You may have heard the phrase that success leaves clues, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. Richard Mayberry, author of the Early Warning Report investment newsletter, states that models or paradigms are the systems human beings use to think. We build intricate mental models of how the world works in order to sift and sort through the billions of bits of information that are coming at us at any one given moment and make sense of what is important using our conscious human intellect that can only process about 5 to 7 bits in any one given time. There are ways, however, to access higher faculties of the subconscious and superconscious mind. Some samurai-related martial arts, such as Tenshoden Katori Shinto-ryu, among others, are steeped in esoteric mental practices that empower practitioners with highly developed intuitive insight. Yet that is a subject for another time. For now, I'll say that if you are interested in accessing the higher faculties of mind and making use of the estimated 90% of subconscious and superconscious mind power available to you, yet dormant, it all begins with a mindfulness practice. Setting aside time each day to become aware of how your mind operates and deliberately set your intentions toward models of thinking and acting in the way that you would choose doesn't involve being spaced out or changing religions. It just takes time to practice. Of course, if it were easy, anyone could do it. That's why I choose to leverage technology to handle the hard parts. That's what all technology and capital equipment do, by the way. They are labor-saving devices. The same can be said for meditation and auto-suggestion, the driving tools of personal transformation. Everyone knows these things are good for you. I know they have changed my life since being introduced to them back in 2007 after I got back from Iraq, and especially with the stress of conflict involved in studying contemporary politics, a daily mindfulness practice is essential to keeping your sanity and rising above life's challenges. Yet there's always resistance to taking time out and being disciplined. Plus, you always have doubts as to whether you are doing it right on your own. Yet these challenges can be overcome when you leverage technology and the assistance of experts. And that is what I hope for you, to rise above all of life's challenges and create your own dream life. With the power of brainwave entrainment and guided self-hypnosis, you can put your mindfulness practice on a glide path to resilience, strength, and happiness. These are all qualities that you need to achieve your best life and be a net contributor to the security of a free state. Go to everydaysamurai.life/rise to pick up the Rise Above audio track at an incredibly low price. It's infused with sound wave technology to put your brain in the ideal state for mastering your mind. You'll be happier, feel less stressed, and more powerful with just some headphones and the press of a button. Go to everydaysamurai.life/rise today. That's everydaysamurai.life/rise. So, in the purely rational and scientific realm of political economy, and with the American Republic in mind, the model of success is fairly straightforward, spelled out in the U.S. Constitution: a gold and silver-based monetary system and militia-based security system. The dual pillars of purse and sword, or money and militia, set the foundation for a political economy of liberty and self-government. Obviously, the United States no longer has either of those pillars standing. The debt-based Federal Reserve note has commandeered the entire global monetary system, and the militia of the several states have been displaced by federal bureaucracies. While the United States Constitution has obviously failed to restrain the mischief of political actors, we can use it as the model for diagnosing the dysfunction witnessed in political and economic life today. No one in my awareness has done more to examine the money and militia systems prescribed by the Constitution than Dr. Edwin Vieira. He holds 4 degrees from Harvard University, including a Juris Doctor and Doctor of Philosophy. Some of his books include Pieces of Eight, Constitutional Homeland Security, and How to Dethrone the Imperial Judiciary. Dr. Vieira has even authored model legislation for both revitalizing the militia system and providing a constitutional alternative to Federal Reserve fiat notes. In episodes 37 and 38, we talked to Dr. Vieira about Second Amendment sanctuaries and the threats to gun rights in Virginia. If you haven't yet listened, be sure to go to everydaysamurai.life/37 or 38 to get Dr. Vieira's informative and eye-opening perspectives on the Second Amendment sanctuary movement. He highlighted some legal issues that localities will face when confronting rogue officials at the state and federal levels. This time, we're going to challenge Dr. Vieira with some tough questions on where legitimate authority resides within states and among local political bodies. In the U.S. Constitution, the language is clear. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, according to the Second Amendment. And, according to the 10th Amendment, the general government has no power other than what is specifically delegated to it. We all know politicians and bureaucrats ignore this at every turn and exceed the scope of their offices. The parchment barrier of the Constitution has failed, as stated earlier. Yet analyzing this baseline contract is useful to at least point to the illegitimacy of rogue officials at the federal level and their crimes. It is another matter entirely when the problems are at the state level, like what's going on in Virginia right now. There are two schools of thought to consider. The first being home rule, where sovereignty resides with the local political unit, and the other is known as the Dillon rule, that holds towns, cities, and counties as mere creatures of their states. I've written a bit about the Dillon rule before, and you can find a link to this and other show notes at everydaysamurai.life/39. For now, let's hear Dr. Vieira's views on the issue and what, from his perspective, people at the local level can do when the problem is rogue officials within their state infringing on the most fundamental rights. We'll also explore the differences between a Second Amendment sanctuary and immigration sanctuaries. Stand by for part 3 of our conversation with Dr. Edwin Vieira. I'd like to present a challenge to you in terms of the constitutional order vis-a-vis localities and municipalities within their state structure, because we have a thing called the Dillon rule, which considers localities to be mere creatures of their states. And you mentioned earlier about the localities not having the authority to stand up their own militia because it's a state level function.
Right.
However, I would go back to your book, The Sword and Sovereignty, page 863. So if dire circumstances rendered the magistrates' normal authority utterly unavailable or ineffective, individuals would be justified ex necessitate in forming armed establishments in order to enforce law and order in their own localities. So how do we reconcile?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, it's not a question of reconciling. If the circumstances were such, right, if it had gotten to the point, as the Declaration of Independence talks about, long train of abuses and usurpations, the purpose of which was to impose absolute despotism, when you get to that point at which it's impossible to work through the established forms of government because they've come under the control of usurpers and aspiring tyrants, then yes, authority devolves back to where it has to be in the ultimate set of circumstances, to the people themselves, where they are. And where are they? Well, they're in their localities. And in fact, that's what happened essentially in Massachusetts, happened in Virginia. In Virginia, the militia statute 1773 had expired, and the governor, John Murray, Earl of Dunmore, was loath to have another one passed because he was afraid of the circumstances, right? 1773, 1775, you had, of course, Lexington and Concord. So it's that period of time, 1774, 1775. And so he was prorogued the House of Burgesses, which was the lower house in Virginia, so he couldn't get a statute enacted. And what happened? Well, people in their localities simply continued to operate under the previously existing law. And they continue to organize, and they continue to arm and to train. And then at some point, Murray comes along and he puts out a proclamation from the governor saying, I'm calling up all the militia. I want to take it. And they refuse to respond to him. And they put out another proclamation naming, among others, Patrick Henry as a traitor, and try to get people to join with him to suppress Henry and his friends. And that didn't work. And eventually, the governor absconded to a British man-of-war in Chesapeake Bay with a stolen printing press. And he put out his decrees, and no one paid any attention to him. And then they had an intervening period, so-called interregnum. They didn't have a governor. They hadn't declared themselves an independent state, so they were still technically under the British colonial system. And so they set up a thing called a convention. to pass what they called ordinances because they knew they couldn't pass acts, real statutes, because they didn't have a governor. And the convention passed a number of these ordinances, and one of the most important ones, 1775, was a militia ordinance. It was actually provincial troops, Minutemen, and then regular militia ordinance. And then as soon as they became independent, after 1776, then they started passing statutes again, and once again you see the same process at the state level. So the breakdown occurs in 74 and 75. The government falls into this situation of division between the Tory group, the governor, and the Patriot group in the lower House of Representatives. And so there's a kind of hiatus or interregnum period of, well, what is the law here? We're not exactly sure. And so it devolves upon the people themselves, the ultimate law, as the Declaration of Independence said, later was to say. And they take authority in their own hands. But what do? They follow the same pattern that had been followed under the colonial assemblies. Convention, militia statute, and provincial troop statute was exact same template was used. And then they follow the same process once they reestablish or establish anew their independent state government. So yes, if we get to that situation, and I hate to think of getting to that situation, that's a situation where all bets are off. You don't know what's necessarily going to happen.
That's right. We'd much rather solve the issue before it becomes acute.
Well, who is actually going to emerge? Is it going to be George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Mason? You think of these people, even Alexander Hamilton. I mean, I would be perfectly happy if Alexander Hamilton were the archetype of the politician in Washington today, even though he was a centralizer. He couldn't be possibly worse than the ones they have there now. But are those the kind of people that will emerge when the vast majority of Americans have no idea of what constitutional federalism is about? They're not, and I'm not saying this to belittle them, they're not taught this.
No, they've been indoctrinated to believe in democracy.
Well, that's right. And the worst kind of democracy without limitations. Right? Some people think of democracy, well, that's constitutional democracy, where the majority can't do certain things. And that really is a Republican form of government when you get down to it, as long as you have representation, as long as you're not running on a town meeting basis. But the kind of democracy that many people in this country seem to believe in is, well, if the majority says so, that's the end of it.
Right.
That's Northam. That's Northam is saying this, and the people he has coming into the General Assembly and his Attorney General. This is exactly what they're saying. If we pass these things, that's the law, and we're going to enforce them. How? By military pressure. We're going to call up the National Guard. National Guard is not a Boy Scout operation. That's the mentality of these people. We're talking about Bolshevism here. And the Red Guards, I hate to say that about the National Guard, but I mean, basically, that's what this fellow is saying. This is the Leninist approach. We have a Soviet now in control in Richmond. We're going to come up with these ukases, these dictates, and if you people, if you peasants, if you serfs don't like it, we're going to send the Red Army to take care of you. Tukhachevsky is going to come and use poison gas, which he did, by the way. That's the mentality. Now, I don't know that Northam even knows the name Tukhachevsky, right? Or he understands, the theory of Leninism. But let's face the facts. That's what he's saying.
So these declarations of Second Amendment sanctuary in, I think it's 71 or even up to 90 now.
I think so, yeah.
How does that differ from illegal immigration sanctuary cities?
Well, the illegal immigration sanctuary cities or localities, they have counties too, are designed to frustrate the application of laws which are clearly constitutional. Congress has constitutional power over naturalization, which is how a person becomes a citizen. Of course, naturalization involves how a person gets into the country to begin with. There's another provision that deals with the importation of people into this country. And then, of course, there's the power Congress has over international commerce. So you look at those three, and it's fairly clear to anyone who's actually reading the language that Congress is the one that passes laws that control immigration, naturalization, deportation, if you will, right? Any of those. And if Congress wants to say no one can come in, or if Congress wants to say only people from Sweden can come in, that's the end of it. And in fact, we had a period in this country when Congress was excluding Asiatics, Chinese, Japanese. Some cases went to the Supreme Court on this. Because, Congress has the authority to do this on any basis it wants to. There's no constitutional limitation on it. Even such things as free speech. There's a famous case involving a Czechoslovakian intellectual communist who wanted to come over to the country to give lectures, and the Attorney General refused to give him a visa because there was a limitation on people coming from communist countries, as I recall that. And a number of university professors and administrators and so forth sued along with him on the basis that he had a First Amendment right. They had a First Amendment right. They all had First Amendment rights to listen to this man, and therefore he could come into the country in order to give a series of lectures. went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Supreme Court of the United States said, no, wrong. There's no First Amendment right for an alien to come into this country under any circumstances. There's no. So what the sanctuary cities people are doing in terms of immigration is saying, we are not going to enforce or cooperate in the enforcement of laws which are in fact constitutional. This is nullification. This is secession. This is a matter that, to some extent, at least legally, was settled at the tip of a bayonet in the 1860s. The sanctuary counties, towns, and so forth here in Virginia, the ones I've seen at least, they all say, we are not going to participate in, enforce, condone, fund, whatever, actions coming out of Richmond, or some of them say out of Congress as well, which violate a specific provision of the Constitution. Now, that leaves open the question of whether the particular statute does or does not violate. And obviously, you have to decide that. But they are not saying that no matter what, they're not going to go along with a statute that comes out of Richmond, whether it's constitutional or not. It's only those that at some point someone is going to say are not constitutional. And some of these, obviously, if you look at the few times that the Supreme Court has actually made a decision on the Second Amendment, there's that Heller case, the McDonald case, and then there's the United States versus Miller, which is probably the most important one back in the late 1930s. The statutes that I'm looking at coming out of this pre-filing, what they call pre-filing in Virginia, they clearly have extremely serious problems in terms of their constitutionality. So it's not even a question of apples and oranges. These are two, one is a fruit and the other is a nut, if you will. The sanctuary cities people with respect to immigration are saying, but we're not going to abide by constitutional laws. We're thumbing our nose at authority that we are supposed to recognize and abide by. Whereas the sanctuary counties in Virginia are saying, well, yeah, we're thumbing our nose, but we're thumbing our nose at purported statutes that the Constitution tells us we are not allowed to follow. Remember, they all take an oath, at least here in Warren County. I'm sure that it's the same oath used typically throughout Virginia, to abide by and follow and so forth the Constitution of the United States. And that is supreme under Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution to any laws, judicial opinions, executive decrees, whatever, of any state. So in a sense, the Dillon rule is within the body of state law. Right? Typically, your local jurisdictions do not have the authority to act autonomously and to refuse to abide by state laws. But the opposite of that is the situation here. These lower levels of the state government, the counties, the cities, the towns, they have a duty superior to any dictate coming out of Richmond because it comes out of where? It comes out of the Constitution of the United States. So unlike the Dillon rule where the localities would somehow be looking at state law one way or the other to say that they had autonomy, here the localities are looking at the higher level in the federal system to say not so much that they have autonomy, it's that they can't be required to abide by, acquiesce in, obey, etc., an unconstitutional dictate directed to them. No one has a responsibility to abide by an unconstitutional dictate. Supreme Court has ruled again and again and again, an unconstitutional act is not a law. No one is required to follow it. No one can be prosecuted or otherwise punished for not following it. End of discussion. It isn't there, legally speaking. And that's something, I don't know whether Northam understands this or his Attorney General. The Attorney General would have to understand, he's a lawyer. But I don't know whether Northam understands this. But he really has to think through first, wait a minute, is what we're planning on doing here going to raise a serious constitutional problem? Because if it does, now we have, it's not this Richmond versus the localities, it's Richmond versus the localities and the federal government. Trump, I would think, of course he's got his problems now with this impeachment business, but if I were the President of the United States, I would simply call Northam on the phone, have a private conversation with him and say, look, here's what's going to happen. I'm looking at certain statutes here, these are the ones I can see. You enact these, here's what I'm going to do. You enact any like these, here's what I'm going to do. And I'll tell you the exact statute, and I'll tell you the exact wording of the directive I'm going to give to all your people in Virginia who are members of the militia, the constitutional militia, not just people who call themselves militia. This is what I'm going to do. And you know perfectly well that once I do that, your jurisdiction and your authority over them is gone. So you better think twice. And I would do that up there. I wouldn't make a political thing out of it. Give the man a chance.
Just understanding that there's consequences for his actions.
Yeah, well, that's what he said. That's what Northam said. Oh, if the people don't obey these statutes that we intend to pass, there will be consequences. And someone should tell him, well, there will be consequences too. And the man to do that, of course, is Trump, because Trump is ultimately the commander-in-chief of the militia. And therefore, he is Northam's commander-in-chief. This becomes fascinating in terms of, in a sense, the chain of military command here. The militia are ultimately military or paramilitary organizations. So, I mean, Northam has to look at it and say, could I be court-martialed? I mean, it gets fascinating. The possibility, permutations and combinations here are almost endless. And I don't think those people in Richmond have thought, I don't think that they imagined at all that there would be this tsunami of popular revulsion and resistance. I think they put in what they did and thought, well, we'll get the same thing happen in New York and Connecticut. Few people will complain and badmouth us politically, but we'll pass the statutes and that'll be it.
And the Second Amendment needs to be taken in context with the actual militia as a civic institution as the best way to secure the right to keep and bear arms.
Well, ultimately, if you don't have a militia structure, in the long run, you'll end up not having the right to keep and bear arms. Because you know that the governmental apparatus will have its standing army and adjuncts thereof. I mean, a lot of these police forces now are little standing armies, which have no real connection to the people. I mean, they're all professional in the sense that they're paid to do what they do. That's been the history of country after country after country. Disarm the people, leave the only military power in the hands of a professional standing army beholden to a central governmental apparatus, and tyranny follows. Central governmental apparatuses tend to use standing armies for tyrannical purposes. Probably because the only people who set up systems like that are psychopathic. I mean, I'm coming more and more to that feeling that when you see these systems being organized, they're being organized by people who have basically psychopathic personalities.
We could go down a real rabbit hole with that.
Oh, yeah, you could go on for a very long time about that. And the only way that you stifle that is to have power thoroughly diffused in society so that small cliques of conspiring individuals can't gain controls of a few levers of power and therefore be able to dominate society quickly. And how ultimately you do that? Well, you diffuse the ultimate power. Force. What did Mao Zedong say? Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. He said a lot of things that were wrong, but that he said was correct. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. You turn that around. The people who hold the guns are the ones who hold political power. If you want political power to be held in the hands of responsible people, people who are concerned with the maintenance of a free state, those are the ones who have to have control over the guns. And it can't be simply because they elect a few people to a distant legislature in Washington, D.C. It's because they have the guns and the training themselves.
So the sword has to come before the purse.
That's right. Absolutely. That's how you gain control of the purse, having the sword. What was it Machiavelli said? He said, it is often said that gold will find good soldiers. But I, that is Machiavelli, believe that the truth is that good soldiers will always find gold.
I always refer back to Machiavelli and his Art of War, where he said that good law cannot be found in the absence of militia, nor aught else that is good.
That's true. Machiavelli was a forerunner in that area, at least, of the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers would have agreed with that statement 100%. I can't imagine one who wouldn't have. Maybe one of the Quakers or so forth who were, they were pacifists. But the ones who weren't would have agreed with that.
Tying this all together, I mean, when we look at the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, and then you tie that with the Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 and 16 about the duties and the functions of the militia. This is really the way to ensure federal decentralization a la the 9th and 10th Amendments.
Oh, absolutely. To the extent that the people in Washington, D.C. would have to depend upon the militia coming out of the various states to execute the laws coming out of D.C., would move real control to the lower levels in the organizational chart, if you will. I don't consider the states lower levels in any other sense. And a classic example, remember what happened at the Bundy Ranch fiasco?
Right.
You had the Department of the Interior coming after the Bundy family with respect to some claims that the regulations coming out of the Department of the Interior applied to them, and the Bundys weren't going along with this, and the courts were saying this, saying that. And so they have this standoff. They send in a bunch of armed individuals from the Department of Interior, and a bunch of patriots show up, and fortunately no one was hurt, thank God. Now, you look at that situation, and I've said this to many people. I said, let's assume, for purposes of argument, that those lands that the Bundy family were ranching were legitimately under the control of the government in Washington. Let's leave aside the question of whether there should be public lands of that kind. And let's assume that the Department of Interior came up with a set of regulations applicable to the Bundys, and the Bundys challenged the legitimacy of these. If you had a real constitutional structure, who would be down there in Nevada executing those laws with respect to the Bundys? Well, it would be the militia. You'd have some local people in Nevada, in the militia, probably lawyers and land managers and so forth, and some people with a certain amount of expertise. And they would be called upon under those circumstances to take whatever came out of Washington in terms of what the people in the Department of the Interior thought should be done with the regulations, take a look at them and see how to apply those, execute them with respect to the Bundys. And I think under those circumstances, number one, the regulations would not have been as, let's say, extreme as they were, because the people in Washington would have realized that, wait a minute, we can't go too far with this because the locals won't accept it. And then number two, assuming that the regulations were essentially valid, when the time for enforcement came, what would the local militia people have done? The enforcers, the executors of those laws. Well, they would have come and talked to the Bundys about it. It wouldn't have been a Mexican standoff with armed people on both sides. It would have been local people in the militia talking to a couple of local people from the Bundy family and trying to work something out properly. And if it didn't work out, then the local militia would take the appropriate steps, legal process and so forth, to deal with the situation. And we wouldn't have had this near tragic armed confrontation. That's the way the system ought to work.
It would be near peers looking each other in the eye and coming to some sort of satisfactory conclusion.
Well, they'd be people who knew each other. They'd be people who understood what the local situation really was, what the feelings of the people were, how these regulations should be interpreted under these conditions. Regulations coming out of Washington are always written as vague generalities because the people in Washington don't know all the specifics to which they want to attach their regulatory authority. So who is going to make that determination? And we're talking about legitimate interpretations now. Well, it should be the local people who understand local circumstances. That's where those kinds of applications should be decided. And who ought they to be? Well, the Constitution tells us this. Congress has the power to call forth the militia to execute the laws. And think of the number of people we would have potentially to do this. And they would be people with the appropriate expertise. And so you wouldn't have a centralized body attempting to make decisions all the way down to the local area where they couldn't possibly know in Washington all the ramifications of the problem. And then when they didn't get what they thought was a satisfactory answer, send in some armed body of thugs to try and enforce it or to intimidate the locals or whatever it was they thought they were doing when they went there, and create this kind of a situation which could have led, very easily, to people shooting at each other.
Which is the exact opposite of domestic tranquility that the Constitution was designed for.
That's exactly right. The federal system is supposed to stop that kind of thing from happening. That's what King George and his ministers did in 1775, right? They didn't get the answer they wanted, and they sent General Gage sent his people out with orders, well, indirectly at least, shoot to kill.
And seize the weapons.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, obviously, if colonists had done nothing, then they would have seized whatever they seized and there wouldn't have been any shooting. But he sent armed troops to take military stores from the colonists basically in Concord. And what did he think was going to happen? Or what did Major Smith think was going to happen? Major Pitcairn, Colonel Smith, I guess it was. Major Pitcairn, Colonel Smith. What did they think was going to happen with the grenadiers behind them if the colonials had resisted? Which they did. I mean, you send out armed troops to enforce this kind of a dictate, and somehow you don't expect that kind of a problem? So the beauty of the federal system is, okay, you're going to have some authority at the central level, at the Washington, D.C. level, that will be of general applicability, and then some of that will filter down all the way to the localities, but it has to be tempered by a realization of what's actually going on in the localities. What do these people do? What do these people want? I mean, the ultimate goal is not simply to have dictates coming from Washington. It's for people in the local level to lead their own lives to the greatest extent possible the way they want to live them, right? The blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. What else does that mean?
Friends, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Everyday Samurai and look forward to seeing you next time. Be sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. Like and share the show with someone you think would resonate with our message of securing a free state and personal liberty through the dual path of martial arts and the science of political economy. If you like what you've heard here, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or the podcatcher of your choosing. That is one simple yet really great way you can help spread the word and build momentum toward a community of enlightened warriors in service to liberty. Remember, you can easily supercharge the results of your mindfulness practice, so essential to your health, happiness, and success, with the Rise Above audio track. Get yours today at an incredible 80% discount at everydaysamurai.life/rise. That's everydaysamurai.life/rise. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.